Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Hi, everybody. It's Estelle Erasmus, the host of Freelance Writing Direct, and I've had 3 decades in publishing on both sides of the publishing wall. I'm so happy to say that my book, Writing That Gets Noticed, is now on Poets and Writers' site as one of the best books for writers. Today, I am so happy to have Lara Lillibridge with us. And Lara is the author of The Truth about unringing phones. And we're going to talk all about that. And I want to tell you a little bit about her. She is the author of The Truth about unringing phones, essays on yearning, Mama, Mama, Only Mama, an Irreverent Guide for the Newly Single Parent, and Girlish, Growing Up in a Lesbian Home. Lara is the interviews editor for Hippocampus Magazine and creative nonfiction co-editor for HeartWood Literary Magazine. She holds an MFA in creative nonfiction from West Virginia Wesleyan College. And Lara, it's so good to have you here. We've known each other probably for years through our various connections. I've spoken at Hippocamp when they had the conferences, and I've also written for the crafts column, but I was honored to be interviewed by you recently, and we met in person at AWP. And congratulations on your book. It's really fascinating because it's a memoir, but it's in fragments as well as essays and pieces from your life. And the format, I want to break down and discuss that. But first, I want to say what prompted you to write this book?
So the way that I process anything in life is by writing. And I knew that my next book was going to be about my father. It took me a while to decide I wanted to deal with it, but I knew that that's where I was going because my father was in the end of his life, and we had had a very bad relationship through my childhood. And then I had basically walked away from the relationship the last few years before he had died. And what I was trying to process was my guilt in walking away from my father now that he is old and lonely versus self-preservation, that being around a toxic person, even if they're a parent, is not good for you and not good for my kids. So that was the question that I needed to explore. And as I said, I do that always on the page.
Yeah, and you even explain it in your intro. You talk about what you said exactly. And if I can just say, your intro says, when I was 4 years old, my father moved from Rochester, New York to Anchorage, Alaska, a distance of over 4,000 miles. I spent my childhood chasing after him, flying a quarter of the way around the world to tug at the hem of his jacket, beg him to look at me. As I aged, my adoration of my father and longing for him was layered over with anger, revulsion, and later pity, like a hand-dipped candle. These new emotions fusing with, but not replacing the yearning which remained at my core. My father is in his 80s. Parkinson's has left him with an unstable gait. An old neck injury rendered his voice quiet and raspy. Dementia comes and goes and stays longer each time. My father is a lonely old man, and society says I should be a dutiful daughter, but the only way I have survived my father was to cut myself off from him, having only the most superficial of interactions. And as you said, you end with, this book is my attempt to weigh responsibility versus self-preservation. So you put in Fragments and you have more than 50 chapters. Is that part of the conscious decision you made to not only share fragments like maps and facts and law statutes and all sorts of thoughts and information and lists? Was that part of that whole process?
So it was very interesting. I have always been a writer that writes in the morning for a few hours, writing 1,000 to 2,000 words in a sitting. That had been my practice for years and years and years. And then the pandemic hit and I lost my words. And suddenly, a good writing day was 75 words. If I could get 100 words, that was like once a month. Like the stress of the pandemic just completely overwhelmed me. But I'm a writer like you for AWP's Writer to Writer mentorship. And I was working with a woman and I was asking her to write. And I couldn't ask her to write and not keep writing myself. So I would keep opening Word and writing, and I would tell myself, Ernest Hemingway's quote, just write one true sentence. And I would just try and write a fragment of what I was feeling and just leave it at that. And I was very inspired by the book Heating and Cooling, which is 52 micro memoirs. And a few are a couple pages, but most are in that 100, 200 words, 300 words. But each one of those really encapsulates a moment, a feeling. And that was really what I was hoping to be able to do. The other side of that is when your father is so far away, my memories of my father are flashes. I spent 1 year living with him and I spent summers, but I didn't have a long continuous story. I had little bits. So the fractured form really mimicked the relationship in a way that felt authentic to me.
It does. And you also used, even though it didn't have the traditional narrative arc, there is an arc to your story. So talk to me about those conscious decisions, because I always want people to understand how the sauce is made. And it's really conscious decisions that we as writers and as we build on our craft, we learn more and more how to do it and how to implement that into our work. How did you do it?
So what I do is my first draft is always, everything that I can think of to say. And I ask myself, is there more? And then I keep writing until I say, is there more? And the answer is no. And I'm like, okay, this is done. I have said everything I can say. Then I work with a list of all of my chapters and I color code them. And I color coded what is childhood, what was adulthood, what was dementia, what is a fragment. Of course, now I also have fragmented essays, and then I had some more traditional. There's a few traditional essays in there. And so I had these color coded lists, and I work with that over and over to try and get the balance right. And for example, one thing I learned was one of the topics that I'd originally written about, I wound up with 4 essays, and 4 out of 50 something is not enough to hold weight. So I wound up cutting that whole theme because it was just distracting. So I use my list and I color code it, and I'm continuously reworking my draft, but saving previous drafts to make sure that I don't cut anything that I want later. Then I print it out and I lay the whole thing on the floor. And I walk around and I look at it and I move it and I see, how does the last sentence of this chapter go to the next sentence of the next chapter? How does this thought, where do I need a bridge? And for me, it's too big to just look at it as a scrolling document. I have to have it in piles.
When you talk about bridge, what do you mean by that, Lara?
So one thing could be, I'm talking about my childhood, then I'm talking about my adulthood. I need to get the reader from here to there, you know? Sometimes it's more of an emotional bridge of, I'm talking here about how I'm yearning for my father, and now I'm talking about how I'm not answering the phone when he calls me. Like, okay, what happened? Perhaps we need a little bit more of an explanation of why I went, what changed? Was there a pivotal moment? What was the change?
This is great, hearing your process, and I think it's going to help so many people who are struggling with thinking of different ways of telling their story. So your title, The Truth About Unringing Phones, it's a little bit of a through line, right, throughout your piece. And can you talk about the decision to come up with the title? Because I'm big on titles. I think titles are so important. And how you worked that in as a through line to the story, even to the end.
So it's interesting because there was a call for submissions at Literary Cleveland for a spoken word event where actors act out your essay on a stage. So you submit your essay, but it's not to be published, it's to be acted out. And the theme was the truth. And they wanted you to write the truth about whatever and be creative and think outside the box. And because I was already writing about my father, I just thought, it just popped into my head, the truth about unringing phones, because so much of my childhood was waiting for the phone to ring and it never ringing. And then I could see immediately that parallel of my father waiting for me to call and me not calling him. And because he was out of town my entire life, the phone was the way that we communicated most regularly. So it was easy for that through line to come through. And though I did, think about it a bit in terms of like the balance, but I didn't have to force it. It was a metaphor that just sort of fell into my lap that fit so perfectly with my life experience. In terms of titles, it's cool because I'm sure no one else has that title, partially because MS Word is sure that unringing is not a word. But my publisher, Unsolicited Press, was totally fine with it becoming a word if it wasn't already.
I love that. That's very cool. Unringing. I read it, Unringing, and I thought, yeah, that makes sense. I didn't think at all, oh, it's not a word, but I love that. I mean, look, this is how Steve Jobs thinks different, right? It was together. Nobody ever thought of it that way. They would have used the adverb, think differently, but think different became part of the vernacular. So unringing phones, great. And how did you find your publisher?
So my first book was called Girlish, Growing Up in a Lesbian Home. And with that, I went with the wallpaper, the internet technique of submissions, where I submitted to agents and editors and small presses and big presses and everyone. And I got a 2-book deal and it was wonderful. But with this book, I was very intentional in doing a lot of research as to who I thought were the perfect places for this book. And Unsolicited Press was one of my top 5. And I queried them. Actually, my introductory chapter was part of my query letter, and they took it right away. There was a 2-year wait for it to get published, which I was fine with because I wasn't brave enough to publish it at that moment. But this time, it was a really very well-researched decision.
I really like that you took charge of the decision and how you went about it, because that put you in almost like an equal position. I really like that you had your information. And what was it about Unsolicited Press that really appealed to you?
Their tagline is "No bullshit, just books." And seemed to be small and brave and willing to publish material that other people weren't. And I read some of their books, and the more experimental form, both of the books I read of theirs were both experimental. One was fiction and one was nonfiction. So I knew that they would be comfortable with my weird little essay collection.
Do they take agented work or non-agented work or both?
I'm not sure. I know that they had an open call for submissions and they had been on my radar.
Did you do it with an agent or without
No,
an
I do
agent?
not have an agent.
That's great to know for writers that there are so many options out there, and there are so many great publishers that will support what
Yeah.
you want to achieve with your works. So this is very helpful. Thank you.
Oh, with my first book, it was a very large independent press that published like 800 books a year. And they published just hardcover books for me. And they were beautiful and I loved them and I have no complaints about them. But this time I went to Unsolicited Press saying, I really want a paperback and I really want an audio book. And so I knew clearly what I expected the publisher to do, which the first time I was just like you said, oh, publish me anything you want, I'll be happy.
I like that. And so you said, this is what I want. And why did you want paperback? Did you feel there's more sales with a paperback book?
I do. Personally, I have always chosen to read paperback. I read in bed, it's lighter weight. I read on the plane, it's less weight in your carry-on, and they're cheaper.
I agree.
Everything has gotten so expensive. A $25 book is a harder sell than one that's under $20.
Yes. And for the audiobook, did you do the audio yourself or did
It's
they?
not, we haven't got that far yet. That's still down the
Okay.
road.
I mean, I think audio rights are great to have because with the future of what's happening with AI, who knows? I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity there. So,
You're so smart. I never even thought about AI in terms of that. That's interesting.
oh yeah, I've been thinking about AI a lot. I wrote a piece for Wired that actually ended up in the homepage of Google all about
Oh, great.
AI. And now one of the people that I quoted, William Dameron, who's been on the podcast, he is now mentioned in the dictionary as a quote because he talks about heart disease in his piece that he wrote for HuffPost Personal. Anyway, so he's quoted and it says from piece from Wired. So that's pretty cool.
Nice. Very cool.
Okay, so I want to talk about there's just such beautiful language in this book. Like
Thanks.
page 37, how do you say goodbye to a father you've already abandoned? And, to be very clear and not to give the book away, your father was completely abusive in almost every way you could imagine a parent being abusive. And he did far worse, which I'm not going to give away, which is part of the dramatic arc of the book, where there are some revelations toward the end of the book of things that he did, which you were brave to state. I mean, it's not you, it's him, and you're separate from him. And page 47, referring to you and one of your step siblings, Julie, we got along best with promises of some days in a chain of daisies strung across the country between us. We are sisters built on dreams, and we don't have the scaffolding to support squabbles and arguments, which would inevitably happen if we lived in the same town. So some really lovely metaphor throughout and description. And although it is in fragments, it's not like just kind of very bare bones fragments. Everything has a purpose and it sort of answers what I tell my students, the so what. Each sentence, it leads you to the next part and forms part of this narrative arc of this story. You talk about the mapping. So you map out, you either do illustrations of mapping or you do lists. For example, page 56, you talk about your dad's relationships with people and how he was a hopeless romantic. And then you list unavailable people you've dated. And you don't just do the list, but you actually put the equation in there. So you say, in all fairness to my father, my mother and her partner, Pat, had to give up everything for each other too, being lesbians in the 1970s. Somehow my idea of love was a combination of both things, the yearning for what is not present and the idealization of the forbidden. And then you go into more of your forbidden relationships, and then you say, I needed love to save me. So you give the insight. You don't just give the fragments. So lest anyone think it's just fragments, there is Vivian Gornick. I always go back to Vivian Gornick, the situation, the story, and you share the underlying emotional implication, which is a craft choice and which adds the depth to what you're writing about.
It's always a hard balance between giving the reader enough and giving them too much. I tend in life to be an over-explainer. I call myself the mom-splainer, where I'm always telling my teenagers things that they already know. So it was important for me to allow the reader to connect the dots on their own. But sometimes the revelation that I was experiencing in writing it, was the situation in the story, was the, wow, I can see these parallels now. I can see how, and there's, I think when you have an abusive parent, there's a fear for a lot of us that we've inherited that. And how much am I like my father? And what does that mean about me?
Yes, I mean, you really excavate the emotional relationship, the emotional implications, the abandonment that you felt continuously. Was that traumatic for you working in this way on this project?
More so than any other book I had written. In fact, I would write a fragment and then I would not look at it again for months. I just couldn't bear to. And then when time went on, I could look back and go and see it as a piece of writing, not just as a wound. But for that, it took me longer to write this book than my previous ones for that reason, that I needed to take those breaks from the material.
And I think because you are on the other end of your separation, your self-healing, that probably helped you to have a little bit of that distance. Am I correct on that?
Yes. And, time was really my friend in this book. And for example, I mentioned it was 2 years from when I signed the contract to when it came out. And in that time, my stepmother, my dad's wife of 25 years,
Teresa.
passed away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then my father passed away. And both of those things changed my relationship with the book. And if it had been published when I first wrote it, it would have been an entirely different book. And my wonderful editor at Unsolicited Press, had the grace to let me go back after the final manuscript was turned in and make some changes with things I had learned that I'd gotten wrong or just that I saw differently now. And she was incredibly generous, which is a benefit of a small press.
In terms of, you said that you couldn't remember some things, right? So I would imagine you had to do some research. I mean, there's some very specific dates and facts and information here. So what was the extent and the actuality of the research?
I rely on ancestry.com for dates. My father was married 7 different times, and I was really curious about overlaps. However, he was married in many different states, and they don't all make that information public. So then obviously I had to talk to some people, and my half sister, Julie, was a great source. But another thing that I did that was surprisingly helpful was I went on Zillow and I was able to pull up my father's exact condominium on Zillow. And I was able to see the rooms. I was able to look out the backyard. I was able to take their map and expand it to the neighborhood and to learn that some things, for example, behind my father's house was sort of this swampy wasteland. And my dad always called it the bog. And I thought it was because his wife at the time was from England. But I learned it was actually called Baxter's Bog. And so he hadn't been making it up. That's not an important story, but it was interesting to me. And in my father's condo, he had painted one bedroom dark blue on one wall in the ceiling and then white on the other walls. And 30, 40 years later, the room was still painted the exact same way, which I think part of it was that it was so hard to paint over that dark of a color, but it definitely helped put me back in that space.
That's so interesting. So it was the visual, and the
Yeah.
Zillow was a big part of the visual also, and that gets you also thinking in a different way.
And then I did a straight Google search for my father, and I came up with I had to buy a subscription to Anchorage Daily News to go through their archives and read a bunch of. He was cited in a lot of articles for court testimony, and then this big article about his retirement that I use in the book.
Yes, yes, you use that, the whole article. Did you have to get permission for that?
I mean, I cited it as one would cite a source, and
Yeah,
it's an excerpt, it's not the entire thing. And then I trusted my press to let me
yeah,
know if I needed more
they
than that.
vet everything before, yes. So how has your family responded to this? Because there are a lot of revelations in here that maybe not everybody knew.
So my stepsisters, the children of my father's last wife, we are not in contact. And so we were in brief contact before, my father died, but we are not in contact now. My half sister, Julie, she's dyslexic and reading is more challenging for her. But so we talked a lot about the book, and I don't think there's any surprises for her. My full brother, he says to me, I have good memories and I don't want to remember the bad. And I respect that. I don't want to rob him of what good he got from the relationship. My mom has read it twice, and her response was kind of funny. She said, I loved it so much. And she's like, the writing is so beautiful. And my mom is a writer too. But it was interesting to me because she didn't comment about the emotions in the book or the things that had happened.
You told her story, but obviously she was fine with that because it was public knowledge.
My mom's very supportive of my writing, which is nice. I never have to worry about what she'll think. And I do want to say that I purposefully wanted a small press for this book because it was so personal. A small press, you're going to have a very specific audience. And this wasn't a book that I wanted to show up on Barnes and Noble. I wasn't brave enough for that. I was perfectly happy to have it be something that the right people found, but wasn't blasted all over Times Square.
Appreciate you saying that. And I do appreciate like your bravery in excavating these emotions, excavating these stories, bringing something dark to light in the effort to find healing, which you did find for yourself. So that's so commendable. I want to switch gears now and talk a little bit about your work as interviews editor for Hippocampus Magazine. And what is your role in that? How does that work?
I want to sort of say I made it up as I went along. Donna was looking for an interviews editor, and I volunteered. I had been reading submissions and volunteering at the conference for years. So I was already part of that community. And she gave me free reign so I can interview anyone. The only thing is I have to make sure I don't overlap with the book reviews so that people get either a book review or an interview, most of the time. And I got other members of the Hippocampus community, readers or writers, to join my team as interviewers. And my feeling is any book that someone is excited about and so excited they want to talk to the author, I want to read that interview. So I try to, if it's not overlapping with the review department, I'm all for it. And I'm excited to interview people whose books came out a while ago. It doesn't have to be a new release because, I want to know now that you're 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, what do you know now that you wish you knew then? What would you change? What are you proud of? sometimes when the book comes out, there's so much anxiety and stress, and what will my family think? And, did the dust settle? How did it turn out down the road? Did people get over being mad? So to me, all of those questions are relevant, not just sometimes more relevant than a brand new book where someone hasn't gone through that whole process.
I like that. It's not just somebody who has something to promote immediately with the book coming out. That's very smart. Has any golden nuggets come out that you can remember from some of these interviews?
One of my favorite is from a writer named Kalia Yang, and she writes children's books and memoir. And in fact, she has a brand new memoir out right now about her mother. But one of the things she said that always stuck with me is that when you look at your earlier work, sometimes we cringe, right? We look and we have changed what we think since we wrote that piece 10 years ago. Or if we were going to write that book now, our insights would be different. Our writing is more beautiful, whatever. But she said, it's like looking at a picture of yourself at a younger point in time. It's like seeing your 16-year-old self with the pimples and everything, and you still love that person, even though they were young and flawed. And it's a snapshot. A book is a snapshot of who you were when you wrote it, which is not who you are today.
That's beautiful. I really like that. And it just resonates so much also because we are constantly changing and it keeps us fresh, realizing that this is not who we were. And so we don't have to stick to what we did before. We can keep growing and changing and building our craft. Lara, are there some actionable, because I always like to include actionable writing tips that you can share for somebody wanting to write their story, whether it's in fragments or in essays or just in memoir form, that will make it compelling, make their voice compelling?
I'm really a huge fan of the list. And I've done it as Post-it notes, color-coded Post-it notes on a giant board, as well as just a piece of paper. But color coding what each piece does for your story. Does it move the story forward? Or is it just, wow, that's such a pretty essay, and it doesn't move the story forward at all? And sometimes we have to cut those pieces because when they say kill your darlings, that's what they mean. If it's not serving a purpose, and particularly I think with fragments, but with everything. And in fact, with my first book, I had one chapter that every beta reader said, this really isn't necessary. And I left it in. And now when I look at the book, I'm like, they were right. It doesn't add anything. It was just fun to write, but it doesn't add anything to the story.
I'm going to ask you which one it is. I'm going to ask you.
In Girlish, I wrote a chapter about motorcycle clubs that was just sort of, I have this knowledge, I feel like sharing it, but it doesn't particularly matter.
I see. Okay. But not from this book. It's not from this
No,
book.
not from this book.
Okay.
And the other thing is, get a bunch of different voices, let people read your work and take their opinions and sit with them and throw away the ones that don't work for you, because you are the expert in your own story. And only you, if you include something and everyone says, I don't understand why this is there, and it belongs there, that means it needs to be developed more, right? That means that you're not making it clear to the reader why it's there. But if you're sure it needs to be there, by all means, you should keep it in there. But also, having multiple opinions for me has been very helpful, even if I don't listen to them at all, because I can be quite stubborn. Sometimes it helps you know how strongly you feel. When someone says something, you're like, nope, that is completely wrong. Now I'm not feeling unsure. Now I'm in a place of certainty. And that is very valuable. Though, of course, I have beta readers who I absolutely follow, 99% of what they say. So it goes both ways. Trust your work and get to that place of certainty. And if you're not feeling certain that this book is exactly what it needs to be and is exactly how you want to say it, it's not ready.
And you're the authority on your own work.
Yeah. And all of my books are weird. And I knew by making them weird, they would be less marketable, but I knew it was the only way I could tell my story and the best way I could tell my story. And that was the most important thing to me.
And you own your story. I mean, your story
Yes.
is yours. Well, Lara, this has been wonderful speaking with you.
You ask such wonderful questions, and I so appreciate you having me on. It's been just a delight to talk to you.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.